Well, hello all. Welcome to the Captain's Table. This is Kate Bartolo, the host today, interviewing the esteemed councilman and former county supervisor, Zev Yaroslavsky. Before we delve into Zev's bio and background, I want to just say thank you for tuning in to Captain's Table, spelled with a K, because the founder of it had this brilliant idea to capture the spirit of a ship, where the most interesting people on that ship were routinely placed at the captain's table. That's what this is. And that was created by a campaign veteran and messaging expert, Tom Kaptain, with a K. And some of the most recent podcasts, which are all available, by the way, on the Captain's Table Facebook profile. And some of his past interviewees are Willie Brown, the former head of the assembly, the former mayor of San Francisco, Rick Tuttle interviewing the former mayor and Senate Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg. So it's a good group. So now, for the last 4 decades, Zev Yaroslavsky has been both an LA City Council person and later a county supervisor. He started in politics at age 26 from 1975 to 2014. And in that regard, that man has lived through everything that it really matters in LA's history. And because of that, I'm going to encourage you up front to buy his political memoir. The title is Zev's Los Angeles, From Boyle Heights to the Halls of Power. It's really a must read on LA history and political governments, and you don't need to be a political junkie to really find it captivating. So in introducing Zev, I want to start with an intro that actually came from a very unlikely source. A guy named Jim Newton, who was a former veteran LA Times journalist and bureau chief and editor. And what's surprising about his quotes is that back in the day, I mean, he was really a tough, objective reporter and editor. So that when Jim Newton praises a politician, you need to sit up and listen. And this is what he said. Zev was more often than not a dominant player in virtually every municipal initiative of note since he joined the city council. And later, he said it would be hard to find another major politician anywhere in the country with Yaroslavsky's record for outright art support and achievement. So before we turn it over to Zev and I start asking questions first, I'm just going to name a couple of his accomplishments. Actually, it's going to be more than 2 because there are so many. So just to give you a sense of this, one of the things about Zev, his hallmark, is that he was always fearless in tackling controversial issues. So back in the day, when a guy named Daryl Gates was the LAPD police chief, he led reform efforts to stop LAPD's use of excessive force and improper spying on law-abiding LA residents. Zev is also noteworthy for having authored or championed several successful ballot initiatives. One called Proposition U in the 1980s, I think it was 1983, cut in half the size of new commercial developments near residential neighborhoods. He had another ballot initiative banning oil drilling along LA's coastline. And he was the chief ally in LA City Councilman Bob Ronca's successful ballot initiative that established Olympic cost controls for the then 1984 Olympics. Gosh, in 1996, he sponsored a park bond that preserved a big swath of rural open space, and he developed urban parks throughout the county. On healthcare, he did another ballot initiative that saved 2 essential public hospitals from closure and launched then the building of 3 innovative health clinics focused mainly on working class neighborhoods. He's also the former chair of MTA for 2 decades. So literally a lot of the actions over that time frame were really either devised by or supported by Zev Yaroslavsky. As it relates to the arts, if you like the Hollywood Bowl, and I think it's one of the reasons to live in LA, he led the way to rebuild and modernize the bowl. And he played an instrumental role in getting the Walt Disney Concert Hall built. One of the issues near and dear to my heart is that he created a pilot program called Project 50, and it was focused on permanent supportive housing. And the tragedy is, as his book reminded me, it fell by 1 vote, but I think that what it stood for and the purpose laid the crucial underpinning of Mayor Karen Bass's, I think, vigilant fight to stamp out homelessness. So here's when I first met Zev, dating back a few decades, when I worked as then policy press counsel aide to 2 council members, Councilwoman Pat Russell, Councilman Joel Wax, and I was a personal partner with then Councilman Bob Ronca. My main focus at the time was on enacting needed rental housing reforms at a time when some of the seniors in Joel Wax's district were getting hit with 20 to 40% rent increases. I later spent much of my career focused on the intersection between neighborhoods serving urban development and public policy, mainly in downtown LA. I've done a lot of other things. I've served informally as a strategist and advisor to political campaigns. And one of my proudest services on boards was LAMP, which is the Skid Row homeless serving nonprofit that is now called the People's Campaign. So I'm ready to take it away, Zev, and let's just start going back to your memoir. Zev, why did you choose to write a memoir?
Well, if I'm trained to do anything, it's trained to be a historian. I was a graduate student, got my master's in British Empire history at UCLA, an undergraduate degree in history, of course. And I've always been interested in history, and I've always believed that people who have played a role in any walk of life, whether it's in politics or in business or education or what have you, that if they have a story to tell, they owe it to their generation and future generations to write their own story in their own words. One of the great things about being a historian and doing research is to be able to hear what people who were protagonists in the history, what they had to say about their experience. They were there. They're what we call primary sources. They were there. They were in the arena. Doesn't mean that their point of view is not biased or slanted. Everybody's point of view is slanted in some way because it all depends on what your vantage point is of that historical event. But I was convinced somewhere along the way in my public service career that when I retired, number one on my bucket list was to write my memoir. Not just about my public service career, but also about my early life. I dedicated a chapter in my book to my grandfather, maternal grandfather, who was quite a figure in his own right, an idealist, came to the United States from Ukraine with my 13-year-old mother and her mother, my grandmother, and he was a titanic figure in the life of our family and more broadly in the Jewish community. And I wanted to write about him, and thanks to his writings, I have a lot of information about him. He died 8 years before I was born. And I wanted to write about my parents. I wanted to write about my upbringing, about my education in public schools at Melrose Avenue School, Bancroft Junior High School, Fairfax High School, the teachers that made a difference in my life. Basically, that first part of the book informs the reader about why I became who I was and why I did the things that I did. My human rights activism when I was in college on behalf of Jews behind the Iron Curtain in the USSR who were seeking the right to leave, the right to emigrate. I was one of a number of people around the country and around the world who launched a grassroots effort to try to change the Soviet policy of not allowing people to emigrate. And we were ultimately successful. I mean, not just us, there were a lot of other factors in it, but that was a big part of my life. And one of the reasons that I did, you indicated my battles with the LAPD on intelligence gathering, on law-abiding citizens, on clergymen, on educators, professors that at UCLA, one of whom I had, and ended up having to sue the city and made a few bucks on that lawsuit because it was unconstitutional what the LAPD did at the University of California in Westwood. And the reason I got so involved in it is because some of the experiences I had on visits that I made to the Soviet Union in 1968 and 69 when I was in college. In later years as well, I went to the Soviet Union the first time to meet my aunts, the two closest living relatives I had anywhere on the planet. They lived in Ukraine, and spent a week with them in Ukraine. Unfortunately, I did not meet my grandmother, who went back to the Soviet Union after coming here with a young daughter and grandfather. She died about 4 years before I went to the Soviet Union, so I didn't have a chance to meet her. But if you've been there and if you've seen not basically what is entirely a police state and where people are afraid to talk even in the outdoors, to speak their mind on politics or political issues. When I came back here and saw that the LAPD had a whole division, the Public Disorder and Intelligence Division, that monitored the activities of law-abiding citizens who were anti-war, were promoting desegregation of our schools, so promoting civil rights, progressives, as we would call them today. And I was one of the people who was on their list of people who they monitored. And I said, this is ridiculous. It's one thing to have it happen 9,000 miles away in the USSR. It's another thing to have it in my hometown here what is supposed to be a constitutional republic. And so I took them on, and people warned me not to take on the LAPD. They have ways of getting back at you. And I was too naive or too stupid to be worried about that. Or to put it another way, if once you've gone toe to toe with the KGB, the LAPD is really a walk in the park. So all of those things in the first part of my book inform why I got involved in some of the issues that I did. My parents were Hebrew teachers. They were socialists with a lowercase s. They believed in getting involved in issues that are bigger than oneself. My parents didn't lecture about it. They taught me and my sister through their own actions what it's like to be a public servant or publicly active, civically active. And, I'll tell you that one of my good friends in journalism, Tim Rutten, who passed away a couple of years ago,
Mhm.
used to be the editor of the opinion section of the LA Times, had a column in the LA Times. I've known him since before I was in public office. And I gave him a copy of one of my early transcripts of my book. And he said he loved it. I didn't expect him to say anything else, even if it stunk. But he says, if and when you find a publisher, they're going to want you to either cut down or cut out the first part of the book about your early life. Don't let them do it. And I agreed with him, and there was a reason I wrote it that way, but for the obvious reasons that I've indicated. But I also remember reading Bill Clinton's autobiography, and the first part of his book is about his early life and his early political activities, being the McGovern for President coordinator in Texas. I was on the McGovern for President staff in 1972 as well. And the best part of the book is not the part about his presidency, which he clearly did not write himself. It was like a TikTok. On such and such a day, I met the president of Zambia. The next day, I met the president of Bosnia Herzegovina, and so forth. It was a TikTok. But the first part was really in his voice. And I wanted this book to be in my voice and to lay the groundwork for what's in the public policy part of the book. So about a third of it is a very interesting and I think to some degree entertaining summary of my early life and some of the things that I did and, pranks that teachers that I took on in high school almost didn't let me graduate on the stage with the rest of my class. And the principal of Fairfax High School at that time was Jim Tunney, who just passed away last week, with whom I stayed in touch. Jim Tunney almost didn't let me graduate because I got two unsatisfactories in cooperation. One I deserved, but one that I didn't deserve because I challenged my social studies teacher in the Vietnam War. And he punished me by giving me a U. And in those days, if you got two U's on your report card, they wouldn't let you graduate on the stage with the rest of your class.
Absolutely.
And Mr. Tunney, as we always called him, said, well, do you want to graduate on stage with the rest of your class? And I said, to be honest with you, Mr. Tunney, it doesn't mean a whole lot to me. I'm going to get a diploma either way, but it means a lot to my dad. And my mom had died a few years earlier, and it had been a rough decade for him. And I said, he's had a lot of suffering. It would be unfortunate if we added to his suffering. So Tunney, as I say in my book, he was also an NFL referee, Jim Tunney, very famous NFL referee and good one. He, as I said in the book, I said he never reversed a call in the NFL, but he reversed the call in my case. And we had a nice chat a couple of months ago. And
Zev, I've got it. Hold on. I do have to do a really short commercial break. We'll be right back with the Captain's Table.
Ready to make your brand stand out? At Amplify AI Media, we combine the power of artificial intelligence with creative expertise to elevate your marketing strategy. Our AI-driven approach ensures that every decision is data-backed, every campaign is targeted, and every result is impactful. We amplify your brand's voice louder and clearer than ever before. Amplify AI Media, where innovation meets precision. Visit amplifymedia.ai. Why settle for ordinary when extraordinary is within reach?
Welcome back. So, go on with Principal Tunney.
Well, that's the story of the principal. But my point is that people ask me, what do we want to know that we don't know about Zev Yaroslavsky? And one of the things that people don't know about me is that I'm an incredibly gifted impersonator, if I must say so myself. And I used to impersonate people all the time, whether they were presidents of the United States or actors. To put it more honestly, I was an impersonator of Rich Little, who impersonated those figures. And what got me in trouble with one of my teachers was I did a brutal impersonation of him, and I guess he didn't like it. And I never did it in front of him, but he heard about it from some of the other students, and so Anyway, I made a lot of mischief when I was young, and the mischief I made when I got older were a little more important, and the stakes on what I mischief made were much higher than high school.
Well, I mean, I think who you became, and it is critical to understand how you became the person that you are. You know, you created a career that was devoted to the Congressman Lewis's great line about making good change. I was fascinated by your early years and the experience of going back to the then USSR. I mean, all the things that we take for granted today, which in these times we surely shouldn't, it really stamped you in all the good ways. I mean, I remember hearing that it was pronounced that you're taking on Daryl Gates, the all then omnipresent police chief, was a career ender for you. Well, clearly not.
It was a career ender for Daryl Gates, as it turned
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
But yeah, I think everybody has a DNA, and the DNA isn't just what you find in the 23 chromosomes. It's also the environment in which you were raised, the culture in which you were raised, the values that were imbued in you by your parents, by your teachers, by your clergyman, your rabbi, priest, or minister, imam. There are a lot of things. I mean, like why did you mention the Hollywood Bowl? Why did I make such a focus of my public service career on the Walt Disney Concert Hall project or on the Hollywood Bowl? Basically remodernization or the expansion of the LA County Museum of Art or the expansion and the preservation of the LA County Natural History Museum in Exposition Park.
Yeah.
The oldest institutional building in LA is the original Museum of Art and later became the Natural History Museum. Why did I do all that? Well, I had some great teachers in junior high school. I had a great uncle who played bass for the Saul Hurok's orchestras, which accompanied all these operas from Europe that came to perform in the United States. And LA was one of their stops always. You know, the Bolshoi Ballet from Russia, the Royal Ballet, Margot Fonteyn and Nureyev from England, the Danish Ballet, the Stuttgart Ballet, and all the classical music. In our house, you know, my parents listened to KFAC, which was in the classical music station, is what it was called, the KFAC, the classical music station. That was the music that played in our house. I knew more about Bach and Beethoven than I knew about any of the rock and roll stars that were emerging in the 1960s. So when I become a county supervisor, and county owns the music center, the county owns the Hollywood Bowl, the county owns the two museums, and there was an opportunity and an obligation to try to save them from falling apart or leveraging to make them greater institutions, it was a no-brainer for me. And by the way, one of the people who taught me about this was the man one of the people you worked for, Joel Wax, who I sat next to for many years in the city council. Wax was, if nothing else, and he was a lot more than this, but if nothing else, he was a great advocate for the arts as a public policy issue. And I remember his line, which resonates with me to this day. He says, people don't go to New York for the crime and the graffiti. They go there for the museums and Broadway shows. And, you know, most people in this town don't know how important the arts and culture are, not just to our soul, which goes without saying, but also to the economy of the region. When I say the arts and culture, I'm including television, radio in its heyday, certainly music and now dance and physical art. These are, we have one of the great operas in the country, one of the great operas in the world. I believe we have one of the 5 best symphony orchestras in the world, the Los Angeles Philharmonic. We have one of the greatest symphony halls in the world in the Walt Disney Concert Hall. The greatest amphitheater in the world since Roman times in the Hollywood Bowl. It's one of the things that makes it worth living in LA, especially in the summer. And during the pandemic, when the bowl was dark for one summer, the only time it's ever been dark, even World War II didn't shut it down, but the pandemic did. I was depressed that whole summer. Something was missing, and I figured it's the bowl, because I go to the bowl a lot in the summer. Those things are important to the economy. When we built the new Performing Arts Center at the Cal State Northridge campus, I shouldn't say we put some money into it. It was a CSUN project. When that beautiful concert hall and Performing Arts Center was built, it was, there were restaurants before it was built. There were restaurants in Northridge that were going out of business. It was just a economically depressed area compared to what it could be. When the Performing Arts Center, now called the Soraya, was built and programs started being performed there, not only did the restaurants survive, but new restaurants opened, businesses opened. It's huge infusion of economic activity, and LA is where the action is when it comes to the cultural arts. Even more than New York, if I have to say so. I gave a talk some years ago in the late 90s about LA and the art scene. I don't know if it's still the case. Pandemic has changed a lot of things everywhere. But in the late 90s, we sold more books in LA than they sold in New York. We had more theaters in LA than they had in New York.
Wow.
We
I didn't
had,
know that.
yeah. I mean, we have a lot of theaters in this town. They're small theaters, 99-seat theaters, and in some cases bigger theaters. But in one decade back then, in the 90s, in one decade, we built the Disney Concert Hall. When I say we, I mean the community. The Disney Concert Hall, which was largely privately funded, the Hollywood Bowl remodel, the LA County Museum of Art, the County Natural History Museum, the Getty Villas, the Getty Center up in Sepulveda Pass, the Performing Arts Center at Northridge, the Broad Stage in Santa Monica. There were about a 10 or 12 projects that were built in a decade. And as I said in that talk I gave at UCLA, I said that if we had just built one of those, if we had just done the Disney Concert Hall in the 1990s or the early 2000s, we would have called it a good decade. If we had done the Bowl and the Disney Concert Hall, it would have been a great decade. We did a dozen projects of significance in this town, and there's no metropolitan area in the history of mankind where so much cultural infrastructure, and not just the big stuff, but even the smaller stuff and the medium-sized theaters and museums and showrooms, more than any other, no metropolitan area had done as much in their time as we've done in our time. And we've been the beneficiaries of it. So I say to the audience, pinch yourself. We're the lucky ones in this generation. So yeah. And how did that all happen? Why do I talk 7 minutes on a 54-minute podcast about the arts? Because my great uncle, George Kukli, used to take me to the orchestra pit at the Old Philharmonic Auditorium and at the Shrine Auditorium to help him turn pages on his music stand while Swan Lake and Giselle were being performed on the stage, because I had a great pair of music teachers where I played the oboe, the woodwind instrument, the oboe, in junior high school, where I got to not only to understand and appreciate music, but I got to be a practitioner of music. As poor as it sounded, I became a practitioner. I understood music, not just as a fan. If it hadn't been for these people in my life, and of course my mother, who made me take piano lessons and made sure I listened to KFAC radio no matter where I was in the house, I would have been focused on something else. And I'd say if it wasn't for Joel Wax, I wouldn't have really understood how the public sector can be a huge lever for expanding and enriching the public spaces and the cultural arts. And in the process, this is a huge economic engine in LA, and the arts do not create a residue. They don't create a toxic waste dump. People come here from all over the place. They watch, they listen, they hear various performances, and then they leave, and they leave their money here with them. So they pay taxes when they come here. They pay bed taxes in the hotel and all that stuff. So I'm a big fan of that as a not just as an art form, but as a public policy element in our lives. And it wouldn't have happened but for my early upbringing.
Well, when I listen to this, I hope that parents and teachers listening to you talk and the exposure that you got that so many other people don't, really, it's just so critically important. And going back to your comments about the value to the city in terms of the local economy, in terms of businesses, which when you have vibrant businesses nearby, they're storefronts, and they make the streets safe because they've got people and lights on and all this. And one of the things I noticed that we don't do adequately, both sometimes as Angelenos and as Americans, is we don't connect those dots. And I think you've just explained that really well.
Well, thank you.
You've talked about the arts a lot, which shows your passion. Give me some other examples of some of your very proudest accomplishments when you're on the city council and then the county board of supervisors.
Well, that's a hard thing. It's like asking me who's my favorite grandchild.
Okay.
But
we can move on.
No, I don't want to move on. I want to give you the list. There are a lot of things. And when Jim Newton wrote the review of my book, I was very touched by it and humbled by it. But I did have my fingers in a lot of different issues. And one of the great things about, especially about the Board of Supervisors, is that every issue known to our society crosses a supervisor's desk every day. Whether it's the environment, whether it's poverty, whether it's criminal justice, the arts, transportation, air quality, all of these things are in the purview of a county supervisor in any county in California. But this is the biggest county, not only in California, but in the United States. So there were a lot of issues in which I was involved. As a city councilman, you mentioned one with the police. I think one of the great outcomes of my battles with the LAPD, and mainly with Daryl Gates, was not the policy issue itself. It was that we cracked the culture that permeated City Hall, where the LAPD was the most powerful political force in city government, more so than the mayor and the city council combined. The police chief could get pretty much whatever he wanted, and you were taking your political life into your hands if you criticized the police department, if you voted against their budget, if you amended their budget to do something else, if you questioned a policy on excessive use of force. And one of the things people told me, your district won't support you. You have a predominantly white district, quite affluent in some parts. But you know what? My constituents actually had my back. And my constituents aren't stupid. No constituent is. I think one of the big mistakes politicians make is they don't appreciate that their constituents are smarter than they give them credit for. They have good instincts. They're working for a living just like we are. In fact, they don't have all the perks that a politician has, and they're out in the community every day, and they live with the consequences or the blessings of whatever the politicians do. And I found it very rewarding, and I'm very grateful to the constituents, both in the city council, where I represented most of the time, and most of the area was the west side, although I represented parts of Sherman Oaks and Studio City towards the end of my city career. They supported what I was doing, because when a police department has an entire division monitoring John Mack, the head of the Urban League, Rabbi Leonard Bierman, Leo Beck Temple, because he was too liberal for their liking and he opposed the war. These were not people who were a threat to the public order in Los Angeles. They were people who had a different point of view, political point of view, than the chief of police. And
exactly. Zev, let me interrupt for just a second.
Yeah.
Sorry, we have to go to commercial break. We'll be right back with the Captain's Table.
Are you interested in financial technology or science topics? How about underreported issues? If so, check out the news media outlet UCast News and UCast Studios. That's www.ucaststudios.com.
Are you confused about Medicare? Center for Healthcare Rights is here to help. The Health Insurance Counseling and Advocacy Program, or HICAP, offers LA County residents free, unbiased information to guide you through Medicare options, enrollment, and benefits. To schedule your free counseling session, call us at 1-800-434-0222. That's 1-800-434-0222, or visit healthcarerights.org. Center for Healthcare Rights. We help people navigate Medicare.
Welcome back to the Captain's Table.
Yeah, so what I was about to say is that the amount of money that was spent on an entire division that was monitoring law-abiding citizens could have been put to better use, not to mention more constitutionally valid use, by putting more footbeats on commercial streets where people would like to see a cop once in a while, or more patrols, quicker response times, investing it more in the 911 system so you don't get a recording when you call in an emergency.
Sure.
All of those things are more important than whether Reverend Regas in Pasadena, one of the churches in Pasadena, what he's sermonizing about on a Sunday, or what Rabbi Bierman sermonized on a Saturday. It's, those, I'm proud of that. And what happened as a result of that is when they saw that there was political life after taking on the LAPD, a lot of other people on the council started to do it more openly. And I consider that one of my more gratifying achievements, if I can call it an achievement. The Olympic Games in 1984, I think is a classic. I have dedicate a whole chapter in my book to that. Bob Ronca deserves the primary credit for it. He led the battle to write a charter amendment that prohibited the city from spending taxpayer money on the Olympic Games. As a result, necessity being the mother of invention, they made a private nonprofit corporation out of the Olympic Games, the LA Olympic Organizing Committee, which raised their money, all the money they needed to stage the games privately through sponsorships and ticket revenues and the like, and through television revenues. And the only two Olympic Games in the history of the Olympic movement, which goes back to 1896, the only two that made a profit were the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles and the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. And the one in 84 made a 50% profit. It cost $250 million, $250 million to stage manage the games, and they got $500 million in revenue. So they ended up with a $250 million profit.
Which is truly remarkable.
Yeah.
How do you see your groundbreaking work on the ballot initiative? I mean, LA is still protected from having to absorb additional costs, but
No, LA is not protected.
it's not?
No, the charter amendment only applied to the 84 games. And
Oh my gosh.
if we had ever had an inkling that there would be another Olympic Games in our lifetime, we would not have applied it just to 84. Nobody could have envisioned that in our lifetime we would see the Olympic Games come back to LA. Too many other cities out there and that sort of thing. So the the charter amendment, it was Charter Amendment N, like in Nancy, Charter Amendment N, approved by 70% of the voters, only applied to those games. And so these games, the city is on the hook. And when Mayor Garcetti and the city council president signed the contract with the International Olympic Committee, one of the things they signed was that they are responsible for staging the Olympic Games, including its finances. In other words, if there are cost overruns and nobody else is picking up the tab, it's the city taxpayers who will pick up the tab. Now, does that mean that we're in for problems? Not if the Olympic Committee, that is chaired by Casey Wasserman, carries out the Olympic Games in the same way that Peter Ueberroth did in the 1984 Games: maximize revenues, minimize expenditures. There's no reason in the world why Los Angeles shouldn't be able to run these games in a profit-making way. We don't have to build anything. I mean, we have to build a few things: a swimming pool at SoFi Stadium, build a track temporarily at the Coliseum. Those are relatively minor expenditures compared to building a new Coliseum or building a new swim stadium or building a new arena. We have more athletic infrastructure in this town than any city in the world that I am aware of. Think about it. And
That's true. Wow. I didn't know that.
Since 84, think about this. Talked about the arts. Let's talk about sports. We've built SoFi Stadium, a new soccer stadium in Carson, a new soccer stadium at Exposition Park, which I had the privilege of going to watch a soccer game. It's a great stadium. Every seat's a good seat. A new arena at USC, Galen Center, a refurbished Pauley Pavilion at UCLA, and I'm sure I'm missing a few. Certainly a renovated Dodger Stadium, a new arena in Inglewood, the Intuit Arena. The Staples Center wasn't here in the 1984 game.
Right.
They're all venues that we didn't have in 84, and we were able to run a great games in 84. And not a penny of, or certainly not a lot of pennies, taxpayer money has been invested in any of these projects. It's largely privately funded. So we should be able to carry out an Olympic Games in 2028. Not only a break-even games, we should be able to make a profit. And what worries me, to be very candid, is because there is no prohibition, that people who are responsible for the games in a pinch may just say, well, we'd rather have a fancy velodrome. The city will pick up the tab. I don't think that's going to be their attitude, but there are a lot of big expenditures that have to be covered.
Well, given the fact that the city has a significant budget deficit at this point, they have to be, they just have to be. And I'm hoping that you're sharing your perspective and your experience with some of the key members of the Olympic Committee.
Well, I've written about it. And you know, when I left office, I went to UCLA to teach and to do some research projects. And one of the things we did at the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy is we wrote a paper in 2015 about the Olympics and the 84 games and the dangers of bidding on the 24 games, later became the 28 games, and the pitfalls. You know, notwithstanding that, the city council and the mayor, Mayor Garcetti at the time, signed a blank check, basically.
Jesus.
You know, I don't want to be an alarmist, but I do think we have to focus a spotlight on that so that everybody understands, both the people who are running the Olympics and the city officials. And I know that Mayor Bass is sensitive to this issue, is that the city should not spend any money on the games. There's no reason for it.
Well, we don't have it to spend.
And we don't have it to spend.
I mean, it's literally as simple as that. Well, let me do this. I want to switch a little bit because this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm learning things. Having read your book, I'm still learning more things from you. So one of the things is you have a pretty unique perspective given your city and county experience and your experience in creating the pilot program for the homeless, which provided supportive services, which is as important as literally a roof over their head. I'd like your perspectives now about LA City and County's commitment to getting people off the streets and into supportive housing.
Yeah, Project 50 was a pilot program which I initiated in Skid Row, where they came out of a trip I took to New York when my son graduated law school in New York. And as long as I was there for his graduation, I asked my deputy who handled homelessness, is there anybody in New York I should see who's expert in homelessness? And she connected me with a woman by the name of Haggerty. Her first name is slipping my mind right now, but she ran Common Ground, which was kind of a offshoot of the Catholic Charities. And they are the group that they cleaned up, and I'd say cleaned up, not in a pejorative way,
Right.
but was able to take the homeless population in Times Square, and those who are old enough to remember what Times Square was like in the 70s and 80s, and bought a hotel right off Times Square on 43rd Street, several hundred rooms, turned it into a transitional housing facility for homeless, for unhoused people. And each floor of that hotel, and I don't remember how high it was, but it was 12, 13 stories. Every floor had a mental health professional and a doctor and a detox kind of programs. And it was a wraparound program. And Roseanne Haggerty was her name. And I said to Roseanne, what do you suggest we do in a place like LA? And she said, let's bring all the people from around the country who have toiled in the homeless vineyards in terms of homeless policy, eradicating homeless. And there are a lot of cities that have done great work on this, and have a 2-day conference. And that's what we did. And what came out of that was Project 50. One of the people there, I think it was from Atlanta or Dallas, I don't remember, said, what I would do if I were you is I would go to Skid Row, which is the epicenter, the central ganglion of homelessness in LA at the time it was.
And still.
And still, but it's also spread all over. But I would do a census of all the people who are unhoused and living on the streets, count them, interview them, find out what they have psychological issues, do they have medical issues, physical issues, etc. And then find the 50 most vulnerable people, that is the 50 people who are most likely to die on the streets in the next year if they don't get some attention, and then make a beeline for them, get them housed, and etc. That's what we did. We ended up housing 75 people. Long story short, it worked. Not only did it work, and nobody fell off the wagon once they got housed. And
by the way, that speaks volumes. That's a really critical point.
And it is cheaper to house people and give them services than it is to leave them on the street. Now, people say, how's that possible? Because when they are on the street, they end up in the emergency room, which costs money, and they end up in jail, which costs money, and what it does to the economy when you have homeless encampments all around a business district. So, long story short, we did another paper at the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, and it was called The History of Homelessness in Los Angeles, the last 120 years. Homelessness is not a new phenomenon here. The new part of the phenomenon is that it's not just in Skid Row, it's not just in Hollywood, it's not just in Venice, it's everywhere. And every community has experienced it, whether it's one tent or whether it's 50 tents. And as a result, it's become a politically potent issue. When it was in Skid Row, it didn't bother anybody outside of Skid Row. When it was in Hollywood, it's Hollywood. Nobody cared about it in Westwood. But now is everywhere. And I told Mayor Bass when she was running, and I would have said the same thing to Rick Caruso. I never had the opportunity to talk to him about it during his campaign. They both promised they would house 30,000 homeless people in their first year as mayor. And I said, you won't house 30,000 people. So don't say something that you can't deliver on. The old political adage is when you want to have a rally, you rent a place that is smaller than the number of people you expect to have because you want the place to look like it's really full and overflowing.
Yes.
You don't want to get a big place that looks half empty. Don't underpromise and overperform.
Over-deliver, yeah.
And, I'm reminded of Antonio Villaraigosa, who promised he would plant 1 million trees in LA when he first became mayor. Well, he only planted 250,000 trees, and they called him, LA Magazine had a cover picture of him and the word failure plastered on the cover, which was really ridiculous. If he had said, I'm going to plant 100,000 trees, and he ended up planting 250,000, he would have been a huge success.
Exactly.
It's all about the appearance and the messaging. So here's the thing. I told Karen, she didn't need me to tell her this. She asked me, what would be the measure of success after 4 years on homelessness? And I said, the measure of success won't be that you house 30,000 people, because you're not going to do that. I said, the measure of success is that if I walk out my front door of my house and walk around my neighborhood, get in my car, drive around town, and I can say, there are fewer homeless people here now than there were 4 years ago. That's the measure of success.
On that note, we have one last commercial break.
Okay.
We'll be right back with the Captain's Table.
Fans of the Andy Griffith Show are raving about a brand new streaming series.
Chris Stone, what are you doing back here in Mayberry?
Your neighbors know they're living next door to a famous movie star yet?
He hasn't answered any of my calls.
That girl's headed right for Heartbreak Alley.
An old-fashioned love story. in a modern-day Mayberry.
Yes!
A streaming series for the whole family.
Who's the only TV character named after 2 insects? And B, of course.
Grandma's cat ate all the laxatives, and, well, we've got ourselves a situation.
Crazy, right?
Don't take any wooden nickels. Wooden nickels. That's a good one.
Those low-down, dirty buzzards.
It's an honor to be here. In fact, at my age, it's an honor to be anywhere.
It's a Christmas miracle.
Bravissimo. We don't know what you're missing.
Mayberry Man, the series. Now available on Prime Video.
These people are living in another world.
And we're back.
So in a nutshell, I think the people, and I think the public is, notwithstanding the public opinion surveys, I talk to a lot of people all the time, and they want to give her a chance to succeed. And
Yes.
they recognize that this is not a problem that's going to be solved overnight. It didn't come up overnight. It's not going to be solved overnight. But as long as there's progress being made, as the old saying goes, nothing succeeds like success.
Yes.
And I believe that she is getting there. She's got to ramp it up a little bit, ramp up the pace. And I think she knows that better than anybody. But she did something that no other mayor has done. And I've said this many times. One of the things, when she spoke to my class at UCLA, she asked, what would be my solution? I said, my solution would be the day you become mayor, after you get sworn in, walk up to the Hall of Administration, meet with the 5 supervisors, agree on someone who should be the homeless czar for this region.
Yes.
Give them the power to build housing, to site housing and all that stuff. And get this town moving. And she nodded her head and she said, great idea. And then when she became mayor, she decided she'd make herself the czar, politically speaking, the czar. And no mayor before her and no politician would have ever dared to assume the total responsibility for this issue because they knew that they would not solve it completely. You know, when we build a highway, you know, there's a beginning, you know, the first shovel in the ground ceremony, then there's a year and a half of tumult and chaos in the community, and then you cut the ribbon and it's over. This thing is never going to be over in the lifetime of any politician. But she assumed that responsibility and she said, I'll be judged by the results. Hold me responsible. And I think that permeates the entire bureaucracy of not only city government, but county government, which is equally, if not more important to the homeless issue than the city is. And it also inspires just average Joes and Josephines around town. You know, that finally somebody's trying to do something about it. And I hear more and more people, I see it on social media, at least she's giving it a try. You know, some people complain, oh, it's not going fast enough. The response is, at least she's trying. And I will tell you, she's succeeding. In my old council district, which my daughter-in-law, Kate Yaroslavsky, now serves in that seat. I would not have recommended going into politics these days, but she's
doing a great job.
She's doing a great job, and she's a great public servant. She's done in less than 2 years the number of homeless on the streets of her district, and there weren't a whole lot of them, but there were several big encampments. She cleaned up the encampments, not by moving them to someplace else, but by housing those people, which is the right way to do it.
Yes.
Don't move it from this corner to that corner. You're just shifting the problem into some other neighborhood. And so they had a 15% reduction in street homelessness in the district. And you can tell, I can tell you, I live in the district.
Oh, yeah.
Once in a while, there's a tent here, and there's a tent there, but they're not 50 tents on San Vicente Boulevard, which they used to be. And her colleague, Tracy Park, who represents the area west of the 405, she's been focused on this as much as Katie has on like a laser beam. And she has some historic problems there. She has Venice. She had that area around the VA. So there are some real challenges, but what it shows is that if you focus and you have a plan, and as the old saying goes, the Air Force pilots say, plan the flight and then fly the plan.
Right.
And there is a way to do this. And the way to do this is get them into housing unconditionally. And then once you get them into housing, give them the services that address the issues that render them homeless in the first place. If it's mental health, give them a psychiatrist. If it's health, give them a doctor. If it's drug abuse or alcoholism, get them into a detox program. And sometimes it's all 3 or more of those things. And it's not easy. It's hard work.
It's the hardest.
It works.
But just one of the things that it emphasizes is the political courage that you show through your career. You now have people, and particularly your daughter-in-law, who are showing the political courage because that's what you have to do to tackle something as complex as this. Shrugging your shoulders, it ain't good enough. We're just 10 minutes out from having to end this. I could talk to you for hours, but I wanted to mention something that I actually thought of your great line about being indispensable to constituents. Well, I've been reading the postmortems about how Dems lost control of the presidency, the Senate, and narrowly the House, in part by misreading the public mood. So I'd really like to hear your perspective on how Dems going forward can do a better job of messaging and listening.
I'm still trying to wrap my arms around the election. I'm data driven. At UCLA, we have a professor in the poli-sci department, political science department, by the name of Lynn Vavrick. She's maybe the most important academic who analyzes presidential elections anywhere in the country, at least that I know of. Maybe there's one or two others. She'll take like 1 million or 2 million voters in every part of the country and analyze what happened. I'm going to be interested in knowing what she concludes, because she's always good about opening our eyes to things that we didn't see. But look, first of all, let's step back a second. Between January 20th of 2021 and January 20th of 2025, it will have been a tumultuous 4 years. First of all, the bulk of the pandemic and its impacts were under Joe Biden's administration. He did a great job on it, but it turned our lives upside down, and we haven't come out of that yet.
We haven't even acknowledged it, is one of the things that really hits me. It's like we endured it, but everybody sort of moved past it and didn't acknowledge this was major trauma, and it was global trauma.
Yeah, it's like losing a member of your family. The grief period has several phases. I don't think we ever grieved enough, about what happened. But we have fewer people going to work from home. People who work are working out of their home. I mean, there are law firms that are closing 75% of their space because their lawyers just won't come in anymore. Professors at UCLA come in to teach, and I'm one of them. That the last couple of years, I've had to move everything during the pandemic to my house because we taught remotely for 2 years. I wasn't going to take it all back to UCLA. And so if you come to an academic building at UCLA, oftentimes you can roll a bowling ball through there because, first of all, and I'll just speak for myself, it saves me 2 hours a day not to go to UCLA if I can avoid it, just the commute there and back. So, and I can fulfill my responsibilities that way. I can meet with my students on Zoom and so forth. That has rippled through the entire economy and a lot of other things. And there's a lot of mental, psychological issues, especially for young people. So I think it's so back to what happened. First of all, there were millions of people who voted in 2020 who did not vote in 2024. I forgot the figure. I think it was 7 or 8 million people who
exactly. Yeah, it was about it was 7 million.
I think we'd like to know who those 7 or 8 million people were and why they didn't come out to vote. The other thing is we had a big inflation period. During these last few years, nothing like it was in 1979 when the CPI, Consumer Price Index, went up 17.5% in 1 year. I remember quite vividly, but 5, 6, 7% increase in prices, and it's much more on certain products. I mean, I get a bagel and lox sandwich at Noah's 2 years ago was $4.75. Now it's $8.15. I can afford it, but I take note of almost a 100% increase. Eggs, we all know about that. So there are people who just were not happy. And if you just look at the obvious, is Kamala Harris was part of the Biden-Harris administration, and it was not credible to a lot of people that she could say, "I'm going to turn this thing around" when she was there along with the president. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm making a political judgment. People just didn't believe. Enough people didn't believe that she could be a reformer when she'd been there. Now, having said that, I want to be very clear. This election was extremely close, and people don't. Trump is running around saying it was a landslide. It was not a landslide.
It was not a landslide.
He didn't get 50% of the vote. He only beat her in the popular vote nationwide by 1.5%. 180,000 votes in the battleground state, if they had flipped a different way, would have had a different result. So it was, and the polls were right. Everybody says the polls had it wrong. The polls had it right. They said it was plus or minus 2%, plus or minus 1.5%. Most of the battleground states, Trump won by a percent and a half.
Mhm.
In Wisconsin, it was exceedingly close. 180,000 votes in those seven
Right.
battleground states. So I wouldn't overstate it, but I do think that the Democratic Party has to articulate, has to win back the working class,
Exactly.
and it's not rocket science, and it's not impossible. We had that same problem after Ronald Reagan. He won over the middle class, the middle class and the working class, and then uh, Bill Clinton came along and he connected with the working class. Barack Obama connected with the working class, and we need to find, we need to articulate. It's not so much finding the right person to run. The right person will emerge, but the right person who emerges has to be somebody who can connect with the people who are suffering. Wealthy people are not suffering,
Right.
as we know, and the people who there's a significant percentage of people who lost their jobs during the pandemic who have never gone back to work, not because they don't want to work. Yeah, and whose incomes are lower now than they were in prior to March 13th, 2020. So it's we and I do a public opinion survey every year, countywide, county quality of life index at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. And one of the things that we've seen is that people who or in the lower half of the income spectrum have never recovered. A good portion of them have never recovered from the pandemic's economic impact, and the people who were at the upper end of the of the income spectrum really never got hurt, and they're doing better. They were doing better during the pandemic than they'd ever done before, and they're doing well now. So we've got to focus on those people who are.
Exactly.
If I could just say one thing, I know we're running out of time, but a little statistic that shocks people. In LA County, close to 40% of the households in LA County have less than a $60,000 a year income. Households, not individual, but a household. And about 18% of county households have an income of less than $30,000 a year.
Jeez.
Now, you can't live in LA on $30,000 a year as a household or $45,000 a year. It's impossible. And we wonder why we have so many homeless on the streets. One of them is just that, is they can't afford to pay the rent.
Yeah. No, well said. Very well said. Well, I do have we have a minute, real quick. What advice would you give young people who are interested in a career in politics?
So I think I can do that in 50 seconds. I tell my students that when you go into public service, especially as an elected official, but not just as an elected official, you've got to look yourself in the mirror and ask, what issue am I willing to lose my job over? What do I stand for? What do I stand for? In my case, it was the First Amendment of the Constitution, freedom of speech, the whole LAPD thing. I was warned, you're going to lose your next election if you do this. I said, I'm willing to lose my election. If that's what it takes, but that's what I stand for. Everybody needs to know what they stand for, and people will respect them for it. I mean, if you do it in a respectful way. And I have another axiom, which is, if you treat people with respect, they will reciprocate. If you treat people with contempt, they'll reciprocate that way too. So know who you are. Listen carefully to what people have to say, because people, the public does know a lot more than we do, because they're out there. And it is a democracy, so you can't just ignore what how people feel, and have a thick skin, especially now with social media. That's something I didn't have to deal with, thank God.
Well, we're going to close on that, because I'm going to tell any young people listening that they should read Zev Yaroslavsky's book, because it'll give them a really good idea of what to expect. So, look, this has been a great hour. I could go on for hours with you. I really appreciate your time and especially your perspectives. So thank you all. And to all, I bid a good day from the Captain's Table.